He promoted himself out of our marriage, but when I found the proof he'd buried, I realized he hadn't just lied about his name. He was covering up a secret that just ripped the earth open. The mahogany desk felt impossibly cold beneath my fingertips, even through the thick veneer of the acceptance letter. "Congratulations, Sarah, senior partner." It was everything we'd worked for, everything he'd worked for, really. Mark's promotion to regional director at Sterling and Finch wasn't just a raise, it was a kingdom. And kingdoms, I was learning, required a certain kind of queen. We celebrated that night in our new penthouse apartment, a space so sterile and high above the city that I sometimes felt like an exhibit in a very expensive museum. Champagne flutes chimed, the skyline glittered, and Mark was radiant. He was finally where he belonged, cloaked in the subtle scent of bespoke tailoring and absolute success. "To us," he toasted, his eyes glittering with predatory satisfaction, "to finally having everything we deserve." I smiled, perhaps a little too brightly, and sipped the crisp, dry bubbles. Deserve. That was the operative word. For 15 years, I had been the quiet ballast in his storm, the supportive spouse who managed the household, entertained the firm's dull spouses, and ensured his shirts were always pressed with the perfect, razor-sharp crease. I had deferred my own freelance graphic design career without a second thought. It was the unspoken agreement. His ascent was our shared victory. The shift started subtly, like a faint tremor before an earthquake. It began with the silence. Our evenings, once filled with planning and shared laughter over takeout menus, became punctuated by long, thoughtful stares at his laptop screen, filled with spreadsheets I wasn't privy to. Then came the subtle criticisms. My choice of wine for a dinner party was a little pedestrian. My dress for the Sterling and Finch gala was a bit too loud for the new office dynamic. I tried to adapt, of course. I bought new clothes, studied financial news, and practiced nodding thoughtfully when he spoke about mergers and acquisitions. I was trying to be the polished accessory his new status demanded, but the distance widened, an invisible moat rising between us in the vast, echoing space of our apartment. I started sleeping on my side of the king-size bed, hugging the edge, feeling the vast, empty chasm where intimacy used to lie. 3 months after the promotion, the silence broke. It was a Tuesday evening. I had spent the afternoon setting up my home studio again, dusting off the Wacom tablet, feeling a small, brave spark of my old self returning. I was sketching out a logo idea when Mark walked in, not knocking, just stepping into the room as if he owned the very air I was breathing. "What's this?" he asked, his voice dangerously level, picking up a preliminary sketch with 2 fingers as if it were something contaminated. "Oh, just an old hobby. I was thinking of taking on a small client, maybe." He dropped the paper onto the desk. It fluttered down like a wounded bird. "A hobby, Sarah? We just closed on a 7-figure mortgage and you're playing with crayons?" He didn't look at me. He looked past me, focusing on the expensive, empty view. "This isn't the arrangement we made." "The arrangement?" My voice was suddenly thin. "The arrangement was that you succeed, and I support you." He finally turned, and the look on his face wasn't just disappointment. It was calculation. It was the face of a man reviewing assets and liabilities. "Yes, and I have succeeded. Spectacularly." He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, his silhouette sharp against the city lights. He stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching taut until I thought the glass might shatter. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, almost regretful, which somehow made it infinitely worse. "Sarah, I think we need to talk about the future." My stomach plummeted. I knew instantly that this wasn't about a delayed vacation or a change in investment strategy. This was terminal. "What future, Mark?" I managed to whisper. He turned back, and the truth, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, left his lips without preamble. "I want a divorce." I stood there, mute, the blood roaring in my ears. The champagne from 3 months ago felt like poison in my veins. You what?" "I'm sorry, Sarah. I realize this is sudden, but it's not. It's been necessary for a while now. I need a different kind of partnership to move forward. Someone who complements the trajectory I'm on. Someone uncomplicated. He gestured around the luxurious, silent apartment. This life is built for one primary stakeholder now. The words were brutal, efficient. He had promoted himself right out of our marriage. I opened my mouth to scream, to fight, to beg, but all that came out was a choked, pathetic sound. "You can't," I finally managed, gripping the edge of the desk until my knuckles were white. 15 years, Mark. We built this life. You can't just decide I'm excess baggage because you got a bigger title? He sighed, a sound of pure, weary exasperation, the sound a CEO makes when dealing with a difficult subordinate. "I'm offering you a generous settlement, Sarah, more than fair. You can take the house in the Hamptons, you can restart your business. You'll be fine. But I need clean lines. I need a clear path. And frankly, your presence is starting to feel like a liability." Liability. The word echoed in the cavernous room. I looked at the man I had loved, the man I had sacrificed everything for, and saw only a stranger wearing my husband's skin. I couldn't process the sheer, cold-blooded finality of it. "You're doing this over a promotion?" I asked, shaking my head, trying to locate the logic in the madness. "I'm doing this because the man I am now requires a different environment, Sarah. And this environment," he looked pointedly at me, "isn't it?" He pulled a thick, sealed envelope from the inside pocket of his blazer and placed it on the desk, right next to my discarded sketch. "This contains the initial proposal from my lawyer. Read it. Be reasonable." He didn't wait for a response. He walked to the bedroom door, opened it, and then paused, turning back one last time. "Oh, and Sarah, don't try to dig up anything. I've been very careful about my past. There's nothing there that can hurt me now." With that, he closed the door, the soft click sounding louder than any explosion. I stared at the envelope, the death warrant of my marriage, and then slowly, hesitantly, I picked up the sketch he had scorned. As I smoothed the crinkled paper, my eyes caught something pressed against the back of the sheet. It wasn't ink. It was a faint, almost invisible imprint left by a heavy, distinctive watermark on a document Mark must have laid over my sketchpad before tossing it down. It was the crest of a defunct, highly secretive private security firm that had been dissolved 20 years ago under a cloud of scandal involving industrial espionage and one very messy disappearance. My blood ran cold again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from a sudden, terrifying jolt of recognition. I had seen that crest before, years ago, buried deep in a box of forgotten college memorabilia, on the back of an old ID card belonging to a man Mark had always fiercely forbidden me to mention. A man Mark claimed was just an acquaintance from a summer job. The name on that ID card was Mark Allister, and the man I just married was Mark Sterling. I looked from the envelope detailing the precise division of our assets to the faint watermark confirming a past Mark had explicitly told me he'd cleaned up. If he wasn't who he said he was, what else was a lie? And why was he so terrified of me finding evidence of a man who vanished 2 decades ago, right when he finally achieved this massive, visible success? The scent of expensive cologne and fresh lies hung heavy in the air. I didn't touch the lawyer's envelope. Instead, I felt a sudden, almost manic clarity. Mark Sterling, the rising star, the pillar of corporate ethics, was apparently built on the foundation of Mark Allister, a ghost from a forgotten scandal. His warning about keeping his past clean suddenly resonated, not as a threat to me, but as a desperate plea from a man whose carefully constructed facade was more fragile than I'd ever imagined. The next morning, Mark was gone before sunrise. His side of the closet was already noticeably sparse. He'd packed surgically, leaving behind only the barest necessities he claimed were too rushed to take, a clear indication that this divorce was not a sudden impulse, but a long-planned execution. I didn't cry. I felt only a burning intellectual curiosity mixed with the terror of discovering my entire marriage had been an elaborate stage play. My first move wasn't to call a lawyer. It was to locate that forgotten box. It was tucked away in the deepest corner of the storage unit we rarely visited, hidden beneath dusty tax returns from the early days of our relationship. The moment I found the battered cardboard container, a wave of nausea hit me. This was the abyss Mark had warned me against. Inside, among college pennants and faded photographs, was the artifact, a laminated, slightly dog-eared student ID card from Harrington University, dated 22 years prior. The face was younger, thinner, the eyes harder, but undeniably Mark, and scrawled across the top beneath the faded photo was the name M. Alistair. Beneath the university's seal was the logo of the defunct security contractor, the same one whose crest was faintly visible on my sketchpad. The ID card itself wasn't the bombshell. It was what was tucked behind the plastic sleeve, a single folded piece of brittle yellowed paper. It looked like a coded memo, dense with abbreviations and numbers. I recognized the formal, slightly archaic typeface. It was the same font used in the initial documents for Sterling and Finch's earliest hushed mergers, documents Mark had always kept locked in his home office safe. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set the memo down and breathe deeply, leaning against the cold concrete wall of the storage unit. This wasn't just a youthful indiscretion, this was systemic deception. If Alistair was linked to that old security firm scandal, and if Sterling and Finch had risen from the ashes of that same corporate mess, then Mark hadn't just changed his name. He had strategically integrated himself into the very structure that had once been his enemy, or perhaps his target. I spent the rest of the day in a local library, ironically a place Mark would never set foot in, meticulously researching the Harrington University security firm dissolution. The official story was financial collapse. The whispers, however, pointed to an internal cover-up involving the theft of proprietary defense schematics that supposedly vanished during the collapse, never recovered. The memo in my hands suddenly felt heavier than gold. I used my phone, photographing every line, every strange alphanumeric string. One sequence jumped out. Raptor/Phase 3/acquisition 44.98 north, 73.12 west. Coordinates. And Raptor sounded frighteningly like a code name for a weapon system or sensitive data. Just as I was cross-referencing the coordinates with geological surveys, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. I hesitated, looking nervously around the quiet stacks. I rejected the call, but it rang again instantly. I picked up, my voice tight. Hello? Silence, thick and cold, stretched across the line. Then a low, synthesized voice, completely devoid of recognizable inflection, cut through the static. Sarah Sterling, you have disturbed an arrangement. The past is not your business. Cease your investigation immediately, or the settlement you desire will be the least of your concerns. My breath hitched. It wasn't Mark. The voice was too cold, too layered, like a machine speaking through a filter. This was professional. This was the cleanup crew. Who is this? I demanded, trying to sound strong. The synthesized voice didn't answer. Instead, it delivered one final chilling sentence before the line abruptly clicked, dead. Your husband's promotion was not the goal, Sarah. It was the key. I dropped the phone onto the library table, staring wildly at the coordinates on my screen. Mark hadn't just divorced me because I didn't fit his new image. He had divorced me because I was a loose end, a potential witness to a secret that was far bigger than a simple career climb. And whatever Raptor/Phase 3 was, it was clearly why he had married me in the first place, perhaps even using our early life together as cover for his infiltration. I grabbed my bag, snatching up the phone and the photo of the memo. I had to get out of the city. If they knew I was digging, they would move faster than any corporate divorce lawyer. I fled the library, sprinting toward the parking garage, my mind racing. Where would Mark Alistair go to retrieve something codenamed Raptor at those specific coordinates? I punched the coordinates into my car's GPS, heart hammering against my ribs. The location pinged. A desolate, heavily forested stretch of land in upstate New York, miles from any populated area, classified on public maps only as State Reserve Land. As I merged onto the freeway, glancing into my rearview mirror to ensure I wasn't being followed, I saw it. Not a black sedan, not a tailing car, but a small, high-powered surveillance drone, silent and black, Rising above the roofline of the parking garage I had just left, its single red light fixed directly on my vehicle. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, realizing that Mark's demand for divorce hadn't been the prelude to his new life. It was the trigger for the termination of mine. The drone began to gain altitude, shadowing me with impossible speed, and I knew I had perhaps an hour before they figured out where I was headed. And then my phone, which I had just set down on the passenger seat, lit up with an urgent text message. It wasn't from the unknown number, it was from Mark. A single picture sent just moments ago, and underneath it, a caption. "Don't go to the coordinates, Sarah. If you go there, you won't just find the truth about me. You'll find out why your father really left that summer 20 years ago." The text message felt like a physical blow. My foot instinctively eased off the gas pedal, and the drone in the rearview mirror seemed to linger, satisfied with the momentary hesitation. Why my father really left. That was the family wound I had spent my entire adult life trying to stitch closed with sentimental narratives of career burnout and disillusionment. My father, a mid-level engineer who worked briefly as a consultant for a niche defense contractor, the very contractor that eventually merged into the shadowy precursor of Sterling and Finch, had simply walked out one week, leaving behind a cryptic note and a lifetime of unanswered questions. Mark knew. He didn't just know the truth about his own fabricated life. He knew the core trauma of mine. This wasn't a divorce. It was a confrontation staged by a ghost who had systematically erased everyone standing in the path of his true objective. The coordinates for Raptor suddenly felt secondary to the devastating implication of his message. If Mark Allister had been at that defense contractor, the same place my father had worked, and if he was now leveraging his position to access Phase 3, then my father hadn't just left. He had likely been a victim, or perhaps an unwilling participant in whatever Mark was now trying to complete. My mind raced through a dizzying array of possibilities. Was Mark silencing me to protect the corporate legacy? Or was he manipulating me into going to that isolated location, turning me into another piece of collateral damage, the same way he might have neutralized my father? I pulled the car violently over to the shoulder, far from the highway, tires crunching gravel. The drone, sensing the change in momentum, hovered ominously overhead. I had to know more about the memo before walking into a potential trap. I pulled out my laptop, the small, battered machine feeling like the only weapon I possessed. The memo's coded language was too complex for a quick hack, but the coordinates were a geographical certainty. State reserve land. Isolated, perfect for a clandestine operation. I quickly searched for public records concerning my father, Robert Vance, and his brief employment history. I found the standard resignation letter, but beneath it, buried deep in an archived legal filing concerning the defense contractor's dissolution, was a single, heavily redacted line referencing an employee who was unable to be located for final disposition. Robert Vance's employee ID number was printed clearly before the redaction blurred everything else. My father hadn't quit. He had disappeared, likely at the hands of the very network Mark Allister had infiltrated and then seized control of. The drone above me suddenly dipped, the red light blinking faster, a clear indication it was preparing to descend or report back. I had seconds. If Mark wanted me to stay away from those woods, it meant the secrets buried there were either his ultimate prize or his greatest vulnerability. And given his threat, they were certainly dangerous to anyone connected to him. I slammed the laptop shut. Running wasn't an option anymore. If I fled, Mark would control the narrative, and my father's fate would remain sealed in corporate obscurity. If I went to those woods, I might walk into an ambush, but I might also find the leverage, or the proof, needed to bring down Mark Sterling. With a deep, shaking breath, I eased the car back onto the road, turning toward the direction of the coordinates, not away from them. The drone followed, maintaining its distance, a silent, mechanical executioner. I drove for what felt like an eternity, the sleek glass and steel of the city melting into rolling hills, then dense, unforgiving forest. The GPS signal began to waver as the reserve land approached. The roads turned from paved asphalt to rutted dirt tracks, forcing me to slow to a crawl. When I finally reached the point where the GPS marked the coordinates, the world dissolved into near total isolation. Massive pines crowded the sky, blocking out most of the sunlight. There was no obvious sign of activity, no gates, no fences, just unbroken wilderness. I parked the car, turning off the engine. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal. The drone, however, seemed to have lost its target signal or perhaps reached the limit of its reconnaissance range, as I couldn't see it anymore. I grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and my father's old, thick hiking boots from the trunk. I checked the small backpack I'd thrown together, water, the photo of the memo, and the original student ID card. I stepped out of the car and into the woods. The air was damp, smelling sharply of pine needles and decay. I followed the faint remnants of what might have been an old logging trail, moving deeper into the shadowed quiet. After nearly an hour of stumbling over roots and pushing through thick underbrush, I found it. Not a facility, not a bunker, but an anomaly. A perfectly circular clearing, unnaturally silent. In the center of this clearing stood a single rusted metal antenna structure, maybe 30 feet high, clearly abandoned for decades. It looked like a relic from the Cold War, half swallowed by vines. Beside the base of the antenna, however, was movement. 2 men in dark, unmarked tactical gear were methodically digging near the structure. They weren't using shovels. They were operating some kind of portable, ground-penetrating radar, scanning the earth around the antenna's base. They were organized, professional, and definitely not park rangers. This was it. Raptor. Phase 3. Whatever Mark Sterling was promoting himself toward, it was buried right here. I crouched behind a massive moss-covered boulder, my heart slamming against my ribs so loudly I was terrified they could hear it over the low hum of their equipment. I had found the secret, but I was hopelessly outnumbered and exposed. Just as I was deciding whether to retreat and call the authorities, a thought quickly dismissed as Mark's reach likely extended into those very offices. One of the men shouted, not in alarm, but in triumph. "We got a solid read here. Metal casing, maybe 6 feet down. Looks like the original containment unit." The second man hefted a specialized laser cutter. As he ignited the beam, sending a searing line of bright, angry light slicing into the earth, a faint, high-pitched whine started emanating from the ground, a sound that was too rhythmic, too electrical to be natural. It was growing louder, buzzing past the noise of the cutter, penetrating bone deep. Then, the man operating the radar suddenly dropped his equipment and staggered back, clutching his head. "What the hell is that sound? My ears are ringing!" he gasped. The other man paused the laser, looking equally disoriented. The high-pitched whine intensified, vibrating through the very rock I was hiding behind. It sounded like something ancient, something volatile, being woken up. Suddenly, the man with the radar unit pitched forward onto his face. He didn't just fall, he went rigid, his body seizing violently before going utterly slack. His partner spun around, terrified, shouting into a comms unit. "We have an unknown energy spike. Subject down. Repeat, subject down." As the remaining operative stumbled toward his dead colleague, the high-pitched sound abruptly stopped. In the sudden vacuum of noise, a new sound emerged from the hole they had begun to cut. A deep, resonant thump, followed by a sound like heavy bolts grinding against rusted metal, as if something massive buried deep beneath the earth was beginning to move. I pressed myself against the cold stone, peering through a crack, waiting for the final revelation to emerge from the disturbed earth when a shadow fell over me. I hadn't heard anyone approach. I turned my head slowly, dread coiling in my throat, to see a figure standing silently over me. It wasn't one of the tactical men. It was Mark, clean-shaven, wearing the same tailored jacket from our final evening, but his eyes held a terrifying absence of warmth. He was holding a silenced pistol, aimed steadily at my chest. "I told you to stay away from the past, Sarah," Mark whispered, his voice completely normal now, devoid of the threats or the synthesized filter. "But you always were such a sentimental fool about your father. Welcome to the burial site." The world narrowed to the unwavering black aperture of the silenced pistol in Mark's hand. For a frozen second, I could only register the faint, sickening scent of the expensive cologne he still wore, a brutal irony in this forgotten clearing. "You used me," I managed, the words catching like grit in my throat. "You used my father's disappearance as cover for your infiltration." Mark didn't flinch. He glanced briefly toward the excavation site, where the surviving operative was still frantically trying to raise someone on his radio, seemingly oblivious to the new arrival. "Used is such an ugly word, Sarah. I utilized resources. Your father was a complication, a weak link. He got spooked when he realized what the true purpose of that research was, not just proprietary schematics, but contained operational readiness. He tried to defect. I simply ensured the transition of his employment records was clean. Alistair was the expendable fiction needed to bridge the gap between the old firm and Sterling and Finch." He shifted his weight slightly, the movement economical, lethal. "And you, my dear Sarah, were the perfect emotionally invested anchor to ensure I maintained a low profile while I worked my way into a position to recover Phase 3. I built my empire on the ashes of what killed your father. You were the perfect decoy, the picture of domestic contentment." The realization slammed into me. The divorce wasn't about my pedestrian wine choices. It was about securing his absolute alibi and eliminating the only person who could tie Mark Sterling back to the chaos of Mark Alistair's past, the moment he was about to unearth whatever was buried beneath that antenna. "What is Phase 3, I pleaded, buying precious seconds, my eyes darting to the hole where the wine had momentarily silenced. Mark allowed a thin, genuinely chilling smile to touch his lips. "Phase 3, my love, is why Sterling and Finch dominates international defense consultation. It's the reason my promotion was inevitable. It's what happens when you perfectly weaponize silence." He raised the gun just a fraction higher, signaling the end of the negotiation. "Now, you have two options. Option A, you disappear quietly in exchange for the Hamptons property and a lifetime of untraceable funds. Option B, you become another cold case in these woods, and the Hamptons goes to my lawyers." Before I could articulate the desperate, impossible bargain forming in my mind, the air tore open. The sound that ripped through the clearing was not the high-pitched whine, but a deafening metallic shriek, followed by a shockwave of displaced air that threw both Mark and me backward. The surviving operative screamed, not from pain, but pure terror, scrambling backward away from the pit. The disturbance hadn't come from the hole they dug. It had come from above. The dense canopy of pine trees directly over the clearing suddenly exploded outwards as something colossal and impossibly fast ripped through the foliage. It wasn't a drone. It wasn't a conventional aircraft. It was a massive, matte black shape, angular and utterly silent now that it had broken through the canopy, hovering 30 feet above the antenna structure. It looked less like a machine and more like a piece of jagged, predatory sculpture. The structure below it, the old metal antenna, began to glow faintly with an internal, sickly green light, humming in response to the hovering object. Mark Sterling, the calculating, composed executive, scrambled backward on his elbows, his professional composure shattering instantly. His face, inches from mine in the dirt, was a mask of pure animalistic panic. "No, it's too early. The beacon wasn't activated yet," he yelled, forgetting me entirely as he stared upward in horrified recognition. The operational operative, having witnessed the death of his colleague and now faced with this impossible apparition, didn't run. He didn't even scream again. He dropped his radio, raised both hands over his head in a gesture of ultimate surrender, and began rapidly reciting what sounded like an oath or a specific decryption key in flawless, rapid-fire Russian. Mark bolted upright, abandoning his weapon, clawing desperately at the dirt toward the hole they had dug. "The containment unit! They found it before the override sequence! Damn it, Alistair, you fool!" He didn't seem to be talking to himself. He was talking to the memory of the man he claimed to have buried. The massive black object above began to descend rapidly, bathing the clearing in that strange, malevolent green light. The light hit the surviving operative, and he didn't seize like the first man. Instead, he seemed to instantly desiccate, his tactical suit collapsing inward as if all moisture and life had been violently vacuumed from his body in a single, silent instant. Mark reached the edge of the pit, peering down, frantic. The heavy grinding sound from below had stopped, replaced by a sickening, wet, sucking noise. "It's breached the shielding! Sarah, get out of here now!" Mark shrieked, turning toward me with genuine terror etched into his face. "Whatever they buried here, it isn't hardware. It's hungry." He didn't wait to see if I would flee. He plunged headfirst into the hole, disappearing into the darkness where the sucking sound originated. I was left alone in the clearing, gasping for breath, the strange craft hovering directly above the cavity where Mark Sterling, formerly Mark Allister, had just voluntarily dropped himself into the abyss. My father hadn't been killed by a rogue defense contractor. He had been protecting the world from this. The hovering entity stabilized, and a single thick mechanical arm extended downward from its belly, aiming directly for the narrow opening of the pit. Then, the arm deployed a small glowing device and dropped it into the hole. A moment later, the sound returned. It wasn't the whine, nor the grinding. It was a rhythmic, heavy thump. 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 Emanating from the earth, steady and deep, like a colossal alien heartbeat echoing up from the darkness. And then, the glow from the antenna structure intensified, pulsing in sync with the sound, and the ground around the pit began to vibrate violently, shedding dirt and rock like skin. The mechanical arm retracted, and the hovering object tilted, its massive shadow engulfing me completely. It wasn't leaving. It was waiting. And whatever was stirring beneath the earth, whatever Mark Allister had tried to contain, was now communicating directly with the object hovering above. I looked down at the spot where Mark had vanished. The ground was shifting, bubbling. I realized I had the chance to run, to leave this nightmare to devour the man who had ruined my life. But the thought of my father, the true victim, anchored me. I had to see what was coming out. Just as I braced myself to scramble back toward the relative safety of the woods, the earth directly beneath the antenna structure didn't just crack, it opened. A vast obsidian surface, wet and segmented, began to rise, pushing tons of soil aside, glistening horribly in the sickly green light. It wasn't a vault or a piece of technology. It was biological, immense, and undeniably awake. And the first thing to emerge, slicked with subterranean mud, was a single, familiar object. Not a weapon, not a device, but a human hand extended upward toward the hovering craft, the fingers splayed wide in supplication, the hand unmistakably belonging to Mark Sterling. But the hand was already beginning to change, the skin darkening and thickening, the nails elongating into razor-sharp talons as the colossal, unseen thing dragged itself, slowly, powerfully, into the weak sunlight. The sight of Mark's hand, no longer the hand of an ambitious executive, but a grotesque parody of human anatomy, was the final sanity-shattering piece of evidence. The transformation was happening too fast, too completely to be anything but a symbiotic, horrifying necessity. Mark hadn't been trying to recover Phase 3. He'd been trying to merge with it, or perhaps to activate its true controller. The creature rising from the pit was not a monster born of science fiction. It felt ancient, terrestrial, something the defense contractor had accidentally unearthed, and Mark Allister had spent 2 decades learning how to either command or placate. I didn't freeze. The adrenaline surging now from sheer primal terror cleared the remnants of shock. Mark's warning, "Get out of here, Sarah," echoed in my mind, not as kindness but as the desperate cry of a partner who realized his key had just unlocked the cage door for something he couldn't control. He had brought this entity to the surface, using the coordinates as his final destination, and now it was claiming him as its first meal, or perhaps its new vessel. The massive obsidian form continued to heave itself out of the ground, easily dwarfing the antenna structure. It moved with a slow, deliberate power that suggested immense weight and patience. The hovering black craft above seemed to respond to this emergence, its green light intensifying, casting the entire clearing in an ethereal, poisonous glow. The surviving operative, still babbling in Russian, suddenly stopped when he saw the emerging mass. He didn't look at Mark's grotesque hand. He looked at the hovering ship and in a burst of clarity shouted, "The override failed! It's the host body! It's taking the command signal!" He wasn't surrendering to the entity. He was reporting its breach to the craft above. That was the lever. Mark Sterling's leverage wasn't the creature. It was the craft. The creature was merely the volatile payload. I ignored the rising bulk of the awakening thing and pivoted, scrambling for the only thing Mark had left behind, the silenced pistol. It felt heavy and cold in my hand. The operative, realizing I was armed and potentially unpredictable, turned his terror toward me, raising his hands again, clearly intending to surrender to the entity or fight me for control. "Don't move," I screamed, leveling the pistol at him. "Who controls that ship?" He hesitated, his eyes flicking between me, the rising entity, and the craft above. The shifting ground around the pit made the creature lurch, its massive form briefly obscuring the view of the hovering machine. "The ship!" the operative choked out, his voice laced with frantic reverence. "It's the quarantine enforcement. It's the only thing that can recall the asset." Asset. Mark Alistair/Sterling was the asset they had buried, and the craft was the retrieval mechanism. His promotion, his divorce, the whole charade was a long, convoluted plan to bring the asset to a place where the retrieval could be executed without bureaucratic oversight. But something had gone wrong with the timing. The creature gave a tremendous shudder. Its bulk stabilized, and it began to shift its form, focusing on the operative. I didn't have time to interrogate him further. I raised the pistol, aiming not at the operative but at the antenna structure, the resonant focus point that seemed to be humming in sympathy with the hovering craft. If the antenna was the beacon, destroying it might disrupt the link. I fired twice. The heavy subsonic rounds struck the rusted metal pole with dull thuds, but the energy field around it seemed to deflect the impact. The antenna barely shuddered. The operative used that moment of distraction. He dropped to his knees, pointing frantically toward the base of the antenna, right where the first man had collapsed. "The failsafe! There is a tertiary receiver! It must be destroyed!" Before I could move, the creature, now visibly shedding its human shell, revealing something chitinous and dark beneath, lashed out a thick appendage toward the operative. The remaining man let out a strangled cry that ended abruptly as the appendage wrapped around his torso. There was no sound of ripping flesh this time, just a horrifying dull crunch as he was crushed instantly. I had perhaps 5 seconds before the entirety of the monstrous entity turned its attention to me, the last remaining variable. I didn't aim for the antenna again. I aimed for the only thing that seemed to have direct communication with the controlling force. The hovering craft. It was a ridiculous, desperate shot. I aimed high, compensating for the distance, and pulled the trigger once, twice, 3 times. The first 2 rounds impacted the craft's matte black hull with no visible effect, but the third, perhaps striking a weak point or catching an energy ripple, produced a visible spark, a flicker of instability in the green light bathing the clearing. The craft instantly ceased its rhythmic pulsing. It emitted a sound like tearing silk, a brief, sharp shriek that momentarily stunned me, and then, with impossible acceleration, it shot straight up through the broken canopy, leaving a vacuum in its wake. The effect on the emerging entity was instantaneous and catastrophic. The monstrous form, mid-rise, stopped moving. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump ceased. The green light vanished, plunging the clearing into the relative gloom of the forest. The massive obsidian body, no longer supported by whatever external energy source the craft represented, collapsed in on itself. It didn't decay or explode. It simply slumped. the colossal weight of it settling back into the pit, the mud and soil rushing in to swallow the unholy remains of Mark Allister, and Phase 3 in a final sickening slurping sound. Silence returned, profound and absolute, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the distant sound of traffic that seemed 1,000,000 miles away. I stood there, pistol smoking faintly in my hand, staring into the now still darkening hole. Mark Sterling was gone, buried by the secret he had dug up, destroyed by the power he thought he could control. I slowly walked to the edge of the pit, peering down one last time into the wet, silent darkness. There was nothing left of the executive, the spy, or the monster. Just the damp earth closing over them both. I didn't touch the memo or the ID card again. They were relics of a world I wanted no part of. I turned and walked away from the clearing, not toward the expensive penthouse, but back toward my battered car, the heavy boots crunching on pine needles, no longer running from a divorce but fleeing the truth that my husband's promotion hadn't been the end of his ambition. It had been the beginning of the world's unraveling. As I reached the highway and pulled onto the empty road, I glanced at my phone one last time. It was completely dead, the battery drained by whatever energy surge had occurred in the woods. I pulled over, slipped the phone into the glove compartment, and started driving east, away from the city lights and toward the rising sun. I was alive. I was free of him. But as I drove, watching the trees blur past, I realized the quiet had returned too quickly. The silence after the explosion was too perfect. The creature was gone. The ship was gone. But the vacuum it left felt less like a victory and more like a pause. My eyes caught my reflection in the passenger window. Beneath the grime and the exhaustion, there was a hardness there now that hadn't existed before. I had faced down a conspiracy that spanned decades and a horror that defied understanding. And then I remembered the envelope, still sitting on the mahogany desk in the penthouse, sealed with the legal seal of Sterling and Finch, containing the generous settlement Mark had promised. A settlement he'd offered right before demanding I keep his past buried. I had no proof of who Mark truly was, only the impossible memory of what I'd seen. But I had the divorce papers. And if Mark Sterling was truly gone, the ownership of those assets, including the highly incriminating records left in his empty office safe, was now entirely up for grabs. I smiled, a slow, cold expression that didn't feel like mine. I pulled over one last time, turning the car around. I wasn't going to the Hamptons. I was going back to the city, back to the penthouse, and I was going to read every single document Mark Sterling had so carefully prepared for his future. The game wasn't over. It had just changed players, and this time I wasn't the supportive spouse. I was the sole inheritor of a corporate ghost empire, and I knew exactly where the bodies were buried.